When you think of a homeless person, who do you imagine? What do you believe are the root causes of family homelessness? And how would you address them in your election?
So, Kata, this isn't something I need to imagine. I grew up in New York in the 70s and 80s, and that was the biggest increase in homelessness at that time that the city had seen since the Depression. And it really struck a nerve with me. I kept asking myself, how can it be in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country on earth, we allow people to sleep on our streets, our neighbors? And so I started volunteering in a shelter in college. I went to work for the National Coalition for the Homeless when I finished school. And again, over the last 30 years, I've worked side by side with folks experiencing homelessness. So I don't need to imagine it. What I know is it's mothers and kids like you. It is New Yorkers and neighbors. It's immigrants like my father who came to this city in his early life. And that is why I've worked my whole career to make sure that we create more housing, because the root cause of family homelessness, as you well know, is housing is too expensive for so many New Yorkers to be able to afford it. And so as mayor, I would ensure that we are prioritizing ending family homelessness as one of the most important things I want to accomplish as mayor.
Give me your best 2-minute pitch about how you are going to revamp the city's approach to family homelessness. Given your experience in the housing and homeless field, how are you going to help these families?
Well, the first thing is that we have to make sure we're reaching families with the resources they need much sooner. It shouldn't be that you have to be on the edge of eviction or already have lost your home to be able to get rental assistance from the city. So I'm going to dramatically increase the funding that we provide by almost $2 billion, including from the city, the state, and the federal government. And I'm going to make it more flexible to intervene earlier. And I'm going to set aside a significant reserve of that money as a flexible tool, especially for those who are experiencing domestic violence. Because I know from my experience that is a huge contributor to homelessness of particularly women and children in this city. So that's going to be one critical piece, is getting resources much more quickly. We're also going to need partnerships in our schools, in our nonprofit organizations, in our community-based organizations, because as you well know, you are connected to those city workers, those community organizations in a way that you aren't to our housing agencies or our homeless agency. And we need to give them the power, the resources to be able to get you that money very quickly to help you stay in your home. The other thing, though, is we need a mayor who actually can get the help that we deserve from Washington, D.C. I'm sure you know that only 1 out of 4 New Yorkers who's eligible for Section 8 or other housing assistance actually gets it. That has to end. I'm the only candidate in this race who's actually worked side by side with President Biden, Vice President Harris. I'm the only one who's helped to shape his proposal for universal access to Section 8. And I'm the only one who knows and works very closely with leaders in Congress to go to make sure we get the help we need from Washington at this point when we are on the verge of an eviction crisis.
Thank you for being here. My question is in regards to getting out of the shelter and staying out. How will you ensure families that leave shelter stay housed? Also, a lot of the city's supportive housing is set aside for single adults. But do you believe the city should create supportive housing using a housing first model for families?
So I absolutely believe in a housing first model for families. And in fact, that's the reason that we made so much progress on family homelessness around this country. when I led the strategy for President Obama, is that we invested again and again in city after city across this country in a housing first model. New York City used to be a leader in that, but it's fallen behind over the last 8 years. We need to lead the country again in those solutions. And I know they can work because I've worked side by side with mayors to invest in supportive housing for families and to make it work. But you also asked about how do we make sure once folks get housed, that they actually stay housed. And that's a critical thing first that we need to do in making sure every resident is getting the housing counseling and other services they need to be able to get jobs, to raise their incomes, to keep their kids in school. But we also need to make sure we're investing in the legal services that you all need as well. Because over and over again, I've seen folks taken advantage of by landlords and pushed out of their housing when we know that with the right help, the right rental assistance, but also with the right legal assistance, that we can keep families in their homes and avoid homelessness in the first place. So those are critical tools. And I also think we need to have an early warning system. Often it's a teacher who knows first that a family is on the verge of losing their home, knows before HRA or other agencies in the city. And we need to make sure we're prioritizing getting help and an early warning system into our schools so that we ensure that we catch families before they fall into homelessness and to keep them housed.
The most common reason families go into shelter is domestic violence. Domestic violence survivors are given a quick deadline to leave the HRA emergency shelters, but they also face obstacles to getting housing. You have to be in a DHS shelter to be referred to the homeless units in new affordable housing. Will you give DV survivors in HRA shelters the chance to live in those new homeless set-aside units? And in the case that the abuser has left, what will you do to help DV survivors stay home and not enter shelter in the first place?
It is absolutely wrong that we wait until someone has already been displaced from their home because of domestic violence in order to get them help. And that's why I would fundamentally reorient our rental assistance program in this city to make it much more flexible, to ensure that we're catching families before they have to be displaced and end up in shelter. And I would make sure that those resources are specifically set aside with a reserve, a flexible reserve for domestic violence survivors. And we also know that there are many other issues related to this as well, whether it's the abusive man in the relationship being on the lease, victimizing in other ways and threatening the women in those relationships that then ends up forcing them to leave their own homes. We also have to work much more effectively with law enforcement and ensure early on with trusted partners that we're bringing assistance and counseling that can learn earlier in ways that women who are being abused can trust, so that we can avoid being displaced and hopefully keep women and their children in their homes rather than requiring them to move in the first place.
DV survivors often find that DV shelters are sited in low-income neighborhoods that struggle with crime, making survivors feel even less safe. Will you change this? And in general, how will you counter opposition from high-income and privileged neighborhoods to the sightings of shelters?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't have to imagine this. I've been fighting these battles my whole career and making sure that we're investing not just in shelters, but in supportive housing in every neighborhood in this city. It's why when folks fought against the Lucerne on the Upper West Side, not only did I join Shams DeBaron and the others who were benefiting from that housing, benefiting from jobs and other support from Goddard Riverside, I actually was an expert witness in that case because of my deep history in working to ensure that every community does its fair share. I led the fair housing strategy for President Obama that drew attacks from Donald Trump when he still had a Twitter account last year, saying we were trying to destroy the suburbs by making sure affordable housing was available in every community. So I know what it takes to make sure that we have equitable planning in this city. I've already said that I would remake our land use process to have a comprehensive plan so that every community does its fair share. And it's why I'm committed to what I call 15-minute neighborhoods, so that we know we can equally distribute all types of facilities across this city to every neighborhood, but also that we're actually investing in underserved neighborhoods to make sure that everyone, no matter what zip code they live in, has everything they need for a life of opportunity in their neighborhood. A great school for their kids, access to a great job or transportation that gets you there quickly, healthcare that would ensure COVID vaccines were much more equitably distributed, and fresh food, parks. Every New Yorker should have within 15 minutes of their front door everything they need for opportunity. Instead, what we know now is the single greatest predictor of a kid's chances in life in New York City is the zip code they grow up in. And when I'm mayor, that's going to stop. I'm going to end it with 15-minute neighborhoods.
In 2019 to 2020, for the 5th year in a row, the number of students who were doubled up or living in shelters topped over 100,000. That's about 1 in every 10 students in our public and charter schools. Students without secure housing have higher rates of absenteeism, and the pandemic has only made the problem worse. Many children still don't have Wi-Fi, and it's hard for parents to monitor their children while also trying to make ends meet. How are you going to make sure that the homeless children don't fall through the cracks of the education system?
Well, first of all, Kim, we're going to prevent that homelessness in the first place with a nearly $2 billion increase annually in our city's rental assistance program. And as I said earlier, making it much more flexible and available earlier on. So we're going to reduce the number of kids that are experiencing that, but we also have to respond quickly. We need to ensure that we create an interagency council on homelessness where the Department of Education plays a leading role. This is what I did as President Obama's housing secretary. I led the National Interagency Council on Homelessness. We brought the education secretary to the table and partnered closely with him, along with every other cabinet secretary that was critical to solving this problem of family homelessness. So I would start with better coordination. I would make sure that we had designated teams in every school with the resources and the training they need to help identify housing instability in families, to intervene earlier. And I would build on the community schools model, which has been a critical initiative to bring wraparound services into our schools to ensure that we're helping not just the children themselves, but their families get what they need in a safe setting, in a way that really ensures that they don't fall into homelessness in the first place. And if they do, that they get everything they need to end that. The last thing I would say is, and you raised this, Kim, is that access to technology, the ability to do your homework in a shelter or another place is woefully inadequate in this city. We have to fundamentally change that. I would ensure every child has a device of their own that they can bring home rather than having to leave it at school. I would ensure that we're keeping our libraries open 24/7 to ensure many places to be able to get Wi-Fi access. And I would ensure that every shelter, all supportive housing, has the free Wi-Fi that we need to make sure that those devices can be connected and that kids can stay up on their schoolwork, connect to their friends and their teachers, wherever they may be.
So when I lived in a shelter, my first room wasn't as big. My last shelter, that went to 4 different shelters, was pretty big-ish, but it wasn't like an apartment or anything. So I found out it was actually $4,000 to give me this thing once, like to stay in my shelter once a month. And I was like, to me, that's ridiculous. Because if I wanted an apartment what's good for me in New York City, it wouldn't have been $4,000 in the first place. I think the money would have been better served for me and my daughter, because I have a 5-year-old, to be paying for rent and have more space instead of being in a shelter and have little space. So the question for you is, sorry, got kind of mixed up. These days, it's popular to say we need housing and shelters. Sorry, we need housing and not shelters. But how exactly would you move away from shelters spending and making sure there is real housing for those most in need?
So, Kate, I will say again, this is not theory to me. I don't just talk the talk on these issues. I'm the only candidate who's actually walked the walk by making big scale changes to reorient systems away from shelter and toward housing. That's what I did when I ran housing in this city and created dramatically more supportive housing. And it's what I did when I led the strategy for President Obama that reduced family homelessness by 25% across this country. We reoriented our shelter systems toward housing by making sure that we were investing in our housing agencies and in every other piece that's needed. I went to Albany and I created a landmark New York 3 agreement that made sure we didn't just have the money to build the housing, but we had money year after year to pay for the services in that housing and fundamentally reoriented the system. And guess what we found out? The supportive housing that we built had dramatic impacts on families' lives. And you know this, you said it yourself, Kaden. It would have been so much better for you, your child, to be in an apartment rather than a shelter. So much easier to do work, have more space to be able to cook yourself, all of those things. But you know what else? We learned that it's actually less expensive as well. And why is that? Because we're spending $3 billion a year. It's that $4,000 a month that you talked about, $3 billion a year in total on hotels and shelters. And guess what? We're also spending far too much imprisoning our kids, treating your health issues in the emergency room rather than making sure that you can get the preventive health care, the maternal health care, all of those things that you need. And when you're in a shelter, you're not getting that help. If you're in supportive housing with the services on site, you will get the preventive care, the prenatal care, all of that you need, the mental health care. Because Lord knows, being homeless is incredibly hard on you, on your kid, and incredibly hard, especially in a year of COVID. And so we need to reorient this system. I'm the only one who's actually done that in my career.
In New York City, New York City has programs to help struggling families avoid eviction, including home-based and city perhaps vouchers. But the voucher rules keep changing. And I have even seen families displaced because their payments from city agencies don't come through. How will you prevent families with vouchers from getting displaced just because the city is not paying its portion? What will you do to include landlords in the conversation once the eviction moratorium ends? Sorry.
I'm the only candidate in this race who has actually testified in front of Congress about the need for the eviction moratorium to be extended, the need for billions of dollars of rental assistance. And in fact, I worked side by side with President Biden and Vice President Harris, with our leaders in Congress, to make sure that we got almost $50 billion in rental assistance in the COVID relief packages that have passed over the last few months. And so I would ensure, because I have those deep relationships and knowledge, that the eviction moratorium is extended for as long as it's needed in this pandemic. And I would work to get that rental assistance at the federal level quickly to the ground, to families like yours, to make sure that you're not ending up evicted or losing your housing, because that flow of federal dollars is incredibly important for consistency and to be able, as you know, to pay higher rents. because too often the city voucher isn't sufficient to actually be able to find decent housing. So I would make sure that we're significantly increasing the federal funding that we have available, but I would also increase city funding as well, raise the payment standards, and ensure that we are paying on a regular basis so that no one is evicted because the city isn't doing its part and paying the rent. But the last thing I would say also, and you mentioned with landlords, it's critically important that we provide everybody in this city who's at risk of losing their housing with the housing counseling and services that they need to be able to be informed, to reach out to landlords. But we also need the legal assistance, because while some landlords will want to do the right thing, we know others are simply looking to get rid of residents, don't want them in the first place. And we need to ensure that we're enforcing the fair housing rules that I created at the federal level, demanding that landlords take, whether it's city vouchers or federal vouchers, and that when there is eviction threatened, that we have the legal resources to make sure to fight back and keep you in your home.
In 2016, they put DHS and HRA together into one system, and Steve Banks was put in charge of it. How do you feel about the way DHS and HRA were combined? And what would you do differently as mayor to make those systems run successfully?
Well, the fundamental problem is when you think you're going to solve homelessness just with homeless programs, HRA and DHS had programs oriented at homelessness, but they're not working collaboratively with our housing agencies, our health agency, our criminal justice agencies. And that's the fundamental problem. You're never going to solve homelessness just with homeless programs. That's why we were so successful at the federal level, is because we brought everybody to the table. And so what I would do on day one is create a single deputy mayor that had not just DHS and HRA under their supervision, but every housing agency and NYCHA, the Public Housing Authority, as well. And only by having everything coordinated under one deputy mayor, creating an interagency council on homelessness for the city, would we really be able to bring everyone together. We need to have a coordinated entry system where every agency is able to understand when a family's at risk, including the Department of Education. Steer those families before they ever end up homeless to the resources that they need, whether it's rental assistance or others, and ensure that we have a truly coordinated response across every agency. Whenever you think you're going to solve homeless programs, whenever you think you're going to solve homelessness just with homeless programs, you are destined to fail. I've seen it over and over again, and I'm the only candidate that's actually made government work across every silo to end homelessness. I would do that as mayor.
Something that we've been asking all the candidates, and you've already kind of gotten to this at several moments, I think, is, are there, especially considering the disparities in terms of like the racial disparities we see in the homelessness population, what are there things to address root causes that have nothing to do with housing that need to be spoken of when we talk about addressing the root causes of homelessness?
Absolutely. And I have been the most outspoken and the most far-reaching in terms of my plans for racial equity in this city. On the day I announced my campaign, I proposed creating, for the first time in the city's history, a chief equity officer reporting directly to the mayor. And that's because I understand that every issue is an issue of equity. So we need to lead with that. Second, as I said earlier, we need to reorient the way we plan our city so that every New Yorker has within 15 minutes of their front door everything they need for a life of opportunity. It is deeply wrong and racist that you can predict the life chances of a child by the zip code that they grow up in. As mayor, that would change, and I would ensure every community is a 15-minute community. I would also make sure that we are taking enforcement of our laws deeply seriously. We've seen in the last few weeks hateful crimes against people based on what they look like, what language they speak, and what race they are.
Like I said before with Steve Banks, I was gonna say Steve Jobs, Steve Banks, they combine it into one thing, but you said he would do like one deputy mayor. Isn't it like the same thing by doing it like that? Instead of having like, I guess not, you could separate them, but make them come together. Wouldn't that be easier instead of having everybody just under one person? And it's like whatever he want to do, he can do with the agencies, and nothing sometimes doesn't get done because one person's in charge of it. Because it's a lot of work. Nitra's a lot, it's a lot of work. It's not easy.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying make it one big agency. What I'm saying is create a deputy mayor. Right now, Steve Banks reports to a different deputy mayor than the housing commissioner does, than the head of NYCHA, the health department. And so what you need to do is make sure there's one person, a deputy mayor, who's ensuring that they're coordinating well. I wouldn't take away jobs. I wouldn't get rid of commissioners. And in fact, I think it was probably better to have HRA and DHS separate rather than combined. But my point is, the key is right now, when you have Steve Banks report and Louise Carroll at HPD and Greg Russ at NYCHA reporting to different people, it's very hard. They're getting instructions from different people to go in different directions, and they're not coordinated. And so what you need is at the highest level coordination where they all come together at one table, and one deputy mayor can make sure that they're working effectively together.